Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lori Edelman, and I'll be your facilitator today. Welcome to our webinar, From Reactive to Proactive IT Service Operations. Our presenter today is Rick Chen. He's Managing Principal at EffectTech. He has spent his career working with enterprise organizations on key IT initiatives that deliver real results. Today he's going to share some of his insights gained during his 15 years in IT. In this series of webinars, Rick is going to break down complex issues into meaningful concepts, best practices, with examples that you can adopt to transform your IT ops team into a high-performing IT service ops organization. Thank you again for joining us. Rick, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. And it will be a webinar series around IT service operations. And this topic is very near and dear to my heart. As I've worked with a lot of enterprise organizations, this has been what we considered as part of the webinar introductions an elusive goal for especially the large enterprise global IT organizations that have complex infrastructure, global presence, etc. IT service operations is an elusive goal. And what we've been doing is spending quite a bit of time formulating what are the missing ingredients of IT service operations, what are the impediments for organizations, and how can organizations achieve IT service operations in their organization. So with that, let's get into the presentation. So let's go through some of the basic concepts of why IT service operations, especially why proactive IT service operations is elusive. And then we get into a little bit of a holistic discussion around the idea of data and data versus information, and some of those concepts are certainly well known, but I'd like to introduce that to you all as part of the second topic in this agenda. And finally, we'll get into some of the key concepts of using your information that you may have in your organization and using that better, more proactively, and certainly more appropriately for you to achieve proactive service operations within your IT groups. So let's talk about IT service operations from an ITIL perspective. In IT service operations, as defined, successful service operations require effective planning, collaboration, and a proactive approach to preventing issues and a swift and effective problem management process. So that's a high-level description, and it's all very good goals, and the statement is good, and people can certainly embrace this definition of IT service operations. And as you move into what is IT service operations, from an ITIL perspective again, IT service operations embraces 5 processes that ITIL defines: problem management, incident, event, access, and request management. So if you can imagine a core service, whether it's a critical application within your organization or a defined mature IT service, you could imagine from an operations standpoint versus design or transition, but from an IT service operations standpoint, the most pertinent ITIL processes are these 5. So with that, though, one of the things that we believe very strong with at EffectTech is there is a missing process within the ITIL framework, and that is config. And ideally, when you look at the definition of what IT server operations is, the idea of communicating the state, the change, the pending changes, etc., of critical infrastructure and applications. One of the key ITIL processes that allow your organization or your group to communicate the status of your particular application stack, etc., of your IT service is through config. And certainly pending changes may come into play, and change and config are certainly aligned, but the idea of an operations standpoint, config is an additional process that we consider to be fundamental to be able to deliver mature, effective IT service operations. So if you look at what ITIL provides, the first 5 and above, the problem, incident, event, access, and request, couple that with config, those process areas we believe are important for you to achieve effective IT service operations. So we live in the real world. ITIL is this framework, as we know, right? And we read the books, we take the tests, etc. But we know from a real life perspective, IT service operations is more than process. We run a business, we're part of a large organization, and we know there are impediments that affect us achieving IT service operations within our organization. And they range from certainly change and releases, and we know from a DevOps perspective and certainly from a cloud perspective, things are changing tremendously within a lot of large IT organizations. Changes are happening more quickly. We know that escalations happen. We know that just mundane things, administrative tasks, budgets, reviews, audits, those things take up a good chunk of our time on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. So in a perfect world, if we didn't have any of these impediments, organizations would have the time, would have the focus to achieve IT service operations. So these are things that we realize that, certainly ITIL doesn't talk about meetings and budgets and reviews, but we know as IT guys or gals in our organization, we know that these things are real, they take up a good chunk of our time, and that prevents us from being proactive as we want to be. So these impediments are real. So what happens? So what suffers is that, we move into a more reactive part of the spectrum, and as we deal with the business, the day-to-day facts of the business, that we have these spectrum of processes, and I lined them up in terms of the reactive on the left to proactive on the right. This is the sequence and order that I came up with when putting this presentation together, is that on the reactive end, there is incident and event management. And on the proactive side, there is config and there's problem management. And somewhere in the middle, there's request and access management that happen. But we know if you look at the reactive versus the proactive, probably the focus that happens is most of the energy is being spent on incident management, certainly request management, and people requesting access to things, access management. These business-facing processes, the ones that the business ask of IT, ultimately get prioritized higher on this reactive-proactive spectrum. Well, if IT is being forced to be a little bit more reactive to the business, what suffers certainly is config and problem. And then remember, if you go back to the initial goal of what is IT service operations, it's effective communication, planning, proactiveness of delivering our services, and the idea of problem and config being pretty much defocused or de-emphasized in our reactive state of IT, in our business-facing focus prioritization. We feel, and we have seen this over and over again with every company that we work with during projects, that we believe and we have seen that config and problem absolutely suffer and get deprioritized. But something else has occurred that we found pretty interesting is that despite a lot of the tooling that large IT organizations have already implemented, tools such as Nagios for event management or transaction application performance management, using AppDynamics, or any of these monitoring tools that monitor the health of my cloud infrastructure, while that has been standard within IT organizations to do event management, we have found that good event management, the ability to take event management to the next level and to cut down on the noise that event management systems generate within IT, has suffered as well. So that even though IT has event systems and multiple tools, on the average, if you look at some of the Gartner statistics, on the average where there's anywhere from 8 to 10 event management tools that are deployed across a large IT organization, to be able to synthesize that information, aggregate that information, correlate, and then reduce the event noise has been very, in our opinion, very subject to an improvement area. And in recent organization, in fact, an organization I go back to when I first met Lori, is all of the information that's being generated, they had an integration to their service desk system. It happened to be a Peregrine system at the time, but events were flooding into the Peregrine system as events / incidents into the Peregrine tracking tool, service desk, and a lot of that information, a lot of that data, I should say, went unnoticed. And people just ignored that and ultimately closed those events after the fact in a large degree. So that happens a lot, and we have seen that recently in another project. So that, even though the tools are there, the integrations are there, that becomes a subjective area that the organizations would potentially benefit from if they go back to improve event management. So what suffers? If the goal again is IT service operations, we want to get there. We look at these 6 process areas that are required to deliver IT service operations. you look at the reactive versus proactive spectrum, and how do we get to proactive IT service operations, where in our belief, in our experience, that this is the state, when Gartner talks about maturity of IT, this is another lens of how mature IT organizations are and why they most fail to achieve proactive service operations. They're doing essentially 3 out of the 6, maybe 3.5 out of the 6 in any reasonable, mature way, and that elusive goal of getting to a good IT service operations practice is always a step outside of our reach. So that's the general premise of where we're at, and now we'll work into some of these aspects of data and how do we improve this? How do we improve these areas to actually achieve our goals? So I'll take a pause here to allow people to ask any questions through chat. So Lori, anything before we move on?
Okay, we have a question from Joseph. We do incident and change pretty well. Of the areas highlighted, what area should we focus on next?
Yeah, so Joseph, if your organization is good at incident management, good at request management, or looking to improve on request management, access management, and you're looking to take the next steps, I would absolutely relook at 2 potential areas. One, certainly, I mentioned just a few minutes ago around event management. You may have multiple tools. You may have 1 or more tools doing event management within your infrastructure. But if you are finding that event management is not optimal, in the sense that I mentioned that the event management tools generate a lot of noise in your organization, or in fact that events, the events that are being sent to you are wrong priority, they're not effective in informing you the impact of your service effectively, they're not doing that, I would actually relook at and take a couple maturity steps in event management. That may be to go through an exercise of rules, understanding the rules that are being generated to generate the events in the organization. So I would take a look at the rules that generate events for you. I would also take a look at better searching tools to be able to surface that information, aggregate that information to make it more relevant and more easily accessible for your organization. A lot of times, in my opinion, I do a lot of remedy work. So I go to an organization and I see a lot of auto-generated events / incidents going into the remedy system. And they get assigned out to the Windows systems administrator, or the Unix system administrator, or the VMware teams, or whatever database teams. They get auto-routed to those generic support teams, and very little information. They usually first in, first out kind of thing happens, but occasionally things that affect your area gets missing, and you don't have visibility to that. I would take a look at that integration between your ITSM ticketing system, whether it's Remedy, ServiceNow, or other tools, to improve that event processing, to make that information more visible, more relevant for you. On the other extreme is around config management, and this has absolutely been an area that people look at quite a bit and have attempted to do. In that same use case with event management tied to config management, I mentioned that all those events are being generated. If you have a large application that maybe have 50, 60 servers, to be able to identify which events impact your application is pretty problematic in that typical integration scenario. So these events are being generated to your Windows or your infrastructure teams, your Windows DBA teams, etc. You don't have visibility to that. And one of the reasons why you don't have visibility to that potentially is because those servers that are generating those alerts are not assigned to your application. So that relationship between applications and infrastructure is a little bit immature. I would take a look at improving that from a config standpoint to be able to surface those events more effectively. So those are the 2 things that I would see. You could take event cleanup, a little bit of config, and you will have better visibility and be able to be more proactive to the issues and events that are occurring that impact your organization or your team. So those are the areas that I would focus on. Any further questions?
Nope, we got a thank you back from Joseph, and looks like we can move on.
Okay. So another holistic discussion let's talk about is around data and information, and you will find this information on the web. So I synthesized that, and I wanted to present about 3 or 4 slides on data versus information. And above that, by the way, Data is at the bottom of this pyramid, if you will. Information is the next layer up. Knowledge you can see, and if you go to the web, you'll see this idea of wisdom. This idea when you get to wisdom, you have achieved this place where your organization is highly effective. But let's talk about data for a second. When you look at data, the definition of data that resonated with me, culling this concept off the web, is data is raw. It's also unorganized. When we talk about this idea of big data or Internet of Things, you can imagine all these devices, Internet-connected devices, sending you raw information about what they are, the status of my engine, the temperature in the cockpit, the oil pressure in my car. You can imagine all of these devices are connected from an IoT standpoint. It's sending a lot of raw data to you or to whatever system. If you dial that back a second and look at data from a classic IT perspective, you have data coming from your servers, your applications, in the forms of logs or events or other trigger messages, chat bots telling you the status of something. So all this information is fairly raw, it's fairly organized, it's hard-coded in the sense that it's being sent out to whatever distribution list or email address or system, and it's being sent to you at any time during the day or night. It could be simple, it could also be something seemingly random. In a lot of cases, a classic use case when I'm talking to another customer is that every quarter at the beginning of the month, right, he would get these random spikes in transaction response times. And Brian, in this case, would say, oh, and that's happening on the East Coast because he does a lot of synthetic transaction monitoring. And this spike where these long timeouts start occurring, he goes, oh, I don't need to worry about that because that happened to be Verizon doing a network upgrade. So it impacted his probes that were sending out these synthetic transactions. But he knew through knowledge and ultimately his wisdom that these random spikes or seemingly random events that occurred was due to some recurring maintenance that were happening at their service provider. So how would he know that? Well, the data wouldn't tell him that, but as you move up the stack, as you can tell in this example, he had the knowledge in this case to know that that seemingly random piece of data was occurring because of the service provider, in this case I think it was Verizon, doing some maintenance work. So useless until it's organized. So that last piece is if you're swimming in data, if you're finding that the data that you have in your organization is useless until it's properly organized, you're suffering from the lack of information. You get the data, but you can't process that. You can't make it useful. You can't turn it into knowledge and action, if you will, but you're getting it. So this is back to the last question that Joseph asked. A lot of times I see event systems generating so much data, even though we're doing a level of rules correlation, we're trying to reduce the noise to some degree. Newer organizations, newer vendors are trying to reduce the noise another order of magnitude more in the sense that the data is too much. It is useless until it's synthesized and organized so that I as a human being can process that information and make heads or tails of that. So as you move up that curve into the information is data, but the difference is that data has been processed, that data has been structured, that data has been made more accessible to you as the end user, that data is relevant. So how do you turn data into information that is relevant? That requires some thought. And finally, information is timely. So the data that's coming to you, it's no use, certainly in the event use case, it's no use to you that you have this process structured perfect event. It's not timely, it occurred 20 minutes ago, then that may or may not help me depending if I'm a system that can tolerate that level of delay. But if I'm a trading application and I have a 20 to 30 minute delay on a critical event, that is not very useful information to me at all. So if you get this idea of data, and the data volumes, as we know from a big data perspective, is growing, be able to process that data and turn that into information, that becomes the next level of maturity that your organization can take to achieve effective IT service operations. If you are at the data level, and be honest with yourselves, if you are struggling with the data issue and you are lacking this information, then that is absolutely one of the big impediments to achieving effective IT service operations. So it has to be processed, has to be structured correctly, has to be accessible, has to be relevant, and has to be timely. So finally, when you get into this knowledge aspect, so we all want to have good knowledge systems or good knowledgeable, individuals, resources, etc. But the application of that information essentially allows the knowledge that could hopefully be retained, right, in your organization of the what and the how. What occurred? How did it happen? We're not quite sure why it happened, but we then can start taking corrective steps to remediate the problem and achieve or avoid the problem in the future. That allows us again to achieve more proactive IT service operations. So you want to get the data, turn it into information. You want to capture the knowledge to understand the what and the how, when it occurred even. Those are the things that will give you the knowledge. To achieve that ultimate level of maturity is you capture the experience and the why it happened. And that's where that elusive, being very predictive, these analytic tools that are being getting a lot of attention in the media, getting into this analytics space, is really capturing the experience and the why that certain things happened, and that's where most organizations want to be, and we have seen a lot of vendors making steps and taking strides in getting there. But first from my standpoint and from my perspective in these slides, understand the data, turn that into information, and then at least capture the knowledge of the what, how, and when aspect, and leave to the why, to the analytics capabilities that are maturing very quickly, but are, in my opinion, not quite ready for prime time for large IT organizations. So with that, this is a key set of foundational information when you look at taking steps to be more proactive, to turn your organization into a more effective IT service operations organization. Make sure you have a good handle on the data and make sure that you can effectively and repeatedly turn that into information that is useful for your end users. Okay? So that's the quick snippet of information that I wanted to lay out for you, and then we'll get into something a little bit more specific around the IT space and tying in this concept of data and information into the IT operations area that we're going to get into, topic number 3. So with that, Lori, we'll take a quick pause. Any quick questions on data and information before we move on?
It looks like Sarah has a question. Okay, kind of 2 parts. Big data has been getting a lot of attention. What is your opinion on this trend? How can IT benefit from big data solutions?
Right, that's a good question. Depending on where you are, and big data, which is an interesting concept for big data technologies. There's a lot of interesting big data technologies that are being, centered around this Hadoop ecosystem. But in a lot of tools, a lot of open source tools allow you to collect this data. So if your organization, Sarah, is suffering for these data silos, where you have these legacy systems, legacy tools that are collecting data for you, but each tool is very specific and purpose-built to collect a certain set of data. Maybe it's your database information, or maybe it's your server information, or maybe it's your application performance information, and they are trapped in these silos, if you will. Embarking on a big data, quote-unquote, big data project will allow you to aggregate that information to make it more, quote-unquote, accessible. It may turn that data into more meaningful information. One of the big things is accessibility. And if accessibility is a key goal, then aggregating key pieces of that data into a big data solution, if you will, would provide meaningful benefits. And another thing, by the way, around big data is that they talk about 3 V's: the variability of the data, the velocity of the data, and the volume of the data. So the variability of the data, these big data technologies can handle database triggers. They can handle system-level events. They can handle logs. So the variability of the data, the big data is meant to address. So you can make a very significant step forward handling that variability, aggregating that data to make it more accessible. The volume of the data also is important, because if you start aggregating all this information, you need timely information. If you need timely information, you can't handle the delays of once a night or once every hour batch process all this information. And this is where big data technologies is able to handle the volume of the data more effectively than potentially a MySQL or a PostgreSQL database can. As you aggregate that information, the volume goes up by 3x or more you can actually, the big data technology can handle that. And you know, the velocity of the data we talk about. In an IT operations world, we need, you know, data to be in pretty much real time, if not, you know, certainly near real time, but ideally in real time. And the velocity of sending a lot of this aggregated, these three sets of data in this example, aggregating that, making it accessible, these big data technologies can do that. They can handle the velocity, they can handle the volume, and they can handle the variability. So big data does have a place in IT. Unfortunately, right now, you know, most of the IT vendors that are focused on big data, they're really focused on gathering the data. They're focused on putting dashboards up and gathering the data. So that's step one. So it's up to you and your organization to make use of that information. So that's where a little additional work, little, you know, additional consulting maybe from the vendor can help you turn all this big data project into something more useful, something into information essentially. So it does have a place. I think there's a couple steps missing from these Hadoop type ecosystems, but certainly it's very promising. And if you haven't, most organizations are looking at this. It's mainly being done from the business side, but IT can benefit from this. And if you haven't started and looked into this, this is something I would encourage you to do.
Okay, we don't have any other questions. I think we can move on.
Okay, so let's get into a little bit more of the meat of this presentation, and we'll tee this up for the next slide. I actually presented this slide a year ago or so, but I wanted to reintroduce this before we take the next step. So from a cloud perspective, you look at the major technologies, the major technology stacks that IT organizations have to wrestle with. And over on the right is the classic traditional on-premise infrastructure stack. So you have networking at the bottom, you have storage servers, virtual servers, et cetera, moving up the stack, all the way to your applications and your services. In the traditional on-premise environment, the organization, the IT organization, owns, supports, and manages the entire stack to deliver that application or service to the business. So you move to the left, the PaaS environment, or platform as a service environment. This is where you may contract out to a private or a public third-party provider to own what is listed here in light blue. So PaaS providers, certainly public PaaS providers like AWS, Amazon, or Microsoft Azure, Google, they will provide you these pre-built environments, if you will, that you can rent from them on an hourly basis, of course, and they will own the networking components all the way up to the runtime middleware components, so that you can put your last three layers of the stack on top of them. So your applications, the data, et cetera, the database, all that stuff that you can manage as a IT shop, you will manage and focus on, and you would third party out, if you will, the items in blue. And if those, you have very unique requirements, you know, you can't stand up a generic Windows or SQL Server environment or a Linux Red Hat environment, you have a little bit more unique environment. You may then contract out and go with an IaaS, or infrastructure as a service provider solution, where they own just those four blue areas, networking, storage, servers, and virtualization technology, and you would own everything else on top of that. So you may have some unique OS requirements, maybe unique middleware requirements, so that you may own, and you would deploy that to your stack and own it and manage and maintain that. So why do I talk about this? So when you look at the evolution, the maturity, and the transition of IT from an on-premise to a cloud environment, hybrid cloud, if you haven't had any exposure to this, is going to be a bigger reality. And certainly I left out SaaS, by the way. SaaS, you know, where application, all the way up to the application stack is being outsourced to folks like Salesforce or ServiceNow or even BMC Remedy, any of the cloud providers. You know, that's something else, and that we'll talk about in a later webinar. But these are the core options that most IT shops have for the majority of their critical applications. And as you, as an IT guy or gal that is trying to deliver service operations, you have to know and have an understanding of what application stack do I have to support, and what parts of the application stack does the vendor provide, and show and highlight and make accessible some of the data in blue that they may provide you. Treating it as a black box is something that we all want, but just keep in mind that you have different parts of the stack. It's dependent on whether you're on-premise or your PaaS solution or infrastructure IaaS solution. So you have to understand these stack concepts from a hybrid cloud perspective. On the far left, we talk about it. I genericize that into you have the service, the application definitions, your middleware, and your runtime area, and your IT infrastructure. That's a simplified version of ultimately what you see across the screen. So I just want to go and spend a couple minutes talking about this cloud primer. So let's go into this. So from an IT service operations standpoint, and I chose IaaS, the infrastructure as a service example, that you have two major groups of data that is being generated out of your application stack. You have what I consider operations data and what I consider development data, your application development data. So in this case, if you're an app person and you're working on a critical finance application, the development teams are focused on building out the app, building out the functionality, building out the database and the tables, and they're probably packaging that up if they're using modern DevOps concepts. They're packaging that up into a continuous delivery model to be able to deploy the runtime onto a set of architecture or middleware systems, right, for my runtime environment. So I deploy that in a continuous delivery model. The development teams own those stack and they own that data. So we, as developers, have a pretty good handle on that data, have a pretty good handle on the error logs and the messages that my application generates. I go through my QA process and I deliver it out using some continuous delivery automation tools. On the operations side, in the IaaS place, this is where the operations teams and the third-party provider are managing and generating data that handles my network storage and my virtualization technology. And certainly, if you know Amazon Web Services, they have a set of tools that are generating data for you to understand the health of my platform, and certainly if we load on top of that my OS and my middleware, we can also include that into the operations platform. So there's a little hybrid concept going on where the third-party provider is generating all the data in blue. My operations team, my cloud operations team, my development team are generating data and managing the data that's operating in the orange. But from a perspective of an IT service operations standpoint, it is our belief that you need to have a combination of the development data and the operations data to do effective IT service operations. Now, what data, we'll get into, do I need to do effective IT service operations to make it useful, accessible, timely, relevant, etc.? But if you look at the stack example, you look at the fact that I have development data that's being generated, I have operations data that's being generated, and the combined development and operations make up this notion of IT service operations. This is the idea that to do effective IT service operations, I need to have a good handle on the data and where it's coming from. That would be the net-net. So hopefully that made sense. Please chat any questions, but this is an important concept as we move on forward with the webinar series. So with that, one more concept is you have your stack. You have the idea that's being developed, segmented into development data and to operations data. And now we talk about all this data and all the key concepts of taking this data and turning it into information. We have to make a decision as a team. If we're going to embark on this IT service operations journey, I have to figure out what parts of the stack that I want to take the data from. I have to figure out that I need to process that data. I have to structure that data. I have to make it accessible, make it relevant, make it timely. I have to meet all those criteria to turn that data into useful information. And then if I do that effectively, I can build a very effective IT service operations foundation for my organization. So this is one of the key concept slides that I wanted to leave you with today to be able to understand the application stack, who owns which part of the stack, where the data is coming from, and can I take elements of all that the data from the different parts of the stack, process it, structure it, etc., to deliver on the service operations vision that we have for the organization. So what do you need to do? So you need to make sure you ask those initial questions. What data is the most value for your particular team? What is the structure that is most beneficial for your team? And if you get through those two initial questions and you go through those different areas and I have that data that's accessible for me, then I have a shot at delivering effective IT service operations. So part of the homework to do potentially for the next, before we get into the next webinar, is ask yourself these two questions. Ask yourself, can I process, is that information processable, if you will, that data is processable, and can I do it at all layers of the stack that is relevant for me? And if you can do that, then you have a valid prerequisite set of steps checked that you can then deliver on your IT service operations vision. If you don't have that, then you will have gaps. And today, we personally have seen a lot of gaps where gaps in this fundamental set of data questions, if they're missing gaps, that absolutely impedes your delivery of IT service operations. And from our perspective, that absolutely creates this very reactive state where you don't rely on the data that you are seeing. You know that there are gaps, meaningful gaps, so with that you develop these shadow processes and shadow tools that are locked within one organization versus another, and that impedes an overall effective enterprise service operation strategy. These fundamental questions, these fundamental data issues have to be resolved for you to move on with that journey. So with that, there is this fun thing that we're going to end this slide presentation with is this IT Ops successful formula. And what is it? So I've given you those key concepts, I hope today, where this IT service Ops successful formula, and this is a little bit play on an ET or FECTEC, but to be able to take your data, take the data that's based on time and transform it. For those of you who remember calculus or algebra or advanced algebra, I'm doing this because I have kids going through high school. This is a transformation formula. And if you apply this transformation formula on your data, you can turn that into information. So you may ask, what is that transformation formula? That is the prelude into the next webinar series, webinar number 2, is this transformation. How do you take this transformation formula, turning your data into information to make it useful for your IT service operations? That's the successful formula. I've given you it, and we'll get into elements of how to create that transformation formula within your organization. In summary, IT service ops, it's all about taking your data that you may or may not have, turning that into information, applying the right transformation rules on that. And what we're going to talk about in the next webinar series, how to implement this winning formula in your organization, how to make sure that you handle it from the different layers of your stack, how you can process it, how you can make it relevant, how you can make it accessible, how you can make it timely to be able to deliver on key aspects of your strategy. So hopefully some of the fundamentals we talked about are useful for you all. Hopefully you look forward to webinar number 2, and we start to get more tangible, more concrete into implementing this formula in your organization to achieve this elusive goal of IT service operations, effective IT service operations within your teams. So thank you for that. We're finished a little early, but if we have any questions, Lori, I'd be happy to answer them.
A couple of slides back, Douglas sent in a question. We can't discover some of our apps. Can these be added manually?
Yeah, interesting enough. So depending on if this is a slide that we're talking about, I mentioned to you that you need to be able to ask yourself, back to this question, what data is the most valuable for your team? And I have this generic concept of all this information being fed in and processed, including applications. And most of the time what happens is, we have found that IT relies on these discovery tools, whether they're from any of the big vendors, et cetera, open source tools. People rely on discovery tools. And discovery tools are good at discovering what they know. They're not so good at discovering what they don't know. And we find that there are a lot of gaps in these discovery tools, including this notion of applications. So if you have a hard time, and we'll talk about this in webinar 2, maybe 3, to define the critical applications and discover them, then the question is, how do you get them? Well, ultimately, it becomes this manual effort. There's no ifs, ands, or ways about it, but can it be easy enough for you to take a manual piece of data that's defining an application XYZ, and how do you process that along with all the other information that's coming in to structure it and make it accessible. That's a very important thing to handle, those exceptions from these automation tools. And yes, by the way, this is getting into probably webinar 3. We believe there's a way to do that and do that effectively to help you address that issue. So that's something that we'll cover in a later webinar.
And Joseph has another question. We have most of this data. What expectations can I set for my management about business value day one?
If you're having this data and you're using this data, meaning it's useful information, I would go back to your key performance indicators, your KPIs for your team, your particular team. And if you're dealing in an operations standpoint, most key performance indicators deal with incident time to resolution. It's dealing with availability, uptime, performance characteristics, those type of things that are meaningful to the business. KPIs are useful. So if you can baseline your KPIs, because even though you have this data, then you can say, well, if I take this journey to improving the usefulness of this data and turning information automatically, or it should be, I shouldn't say automatically, your KPIs will improve. And my sense is, in working with many large organizations, they have the data, they have a lot of the data, they have gaps in the data, but their KPIs are such that, you know, they're usually pretty good, right? Especially senior manager KPIs, but from a lower level, team-oriented KPIs, you will see KPIs improve as we go down to the structured, process-structured, accessible journey. And my sense is you're kind of stuck, or most organizations are stuck in, they have it, they process it, they're in whatever tool of choice, maybe a homegrown tool or what have you, but because it's not accessible, relevant, or timely enough, it's impairing your KPIs. So take a look at those KPIs, be honest about those KPIs, and then let's move this bar along. And my sense is that, and the belief it certainly is, the KPIs will improve. And I will tell you another story about another customer I work with. Is, you know, they have 5 use cases that affect their ITSM system, right? And these 5 use cases are all about things that impact their ITSM system on the day-to-day, week-to-week, certainly month-to-month basis. But these 5 IT use cases, it's important. It's interesting enough is they have the data. That if they looked hard enough, which nobody does, they could take proactive steps to avoid an incident with their ITSM system or their outage. They have the data, but it's not structured in a way, it's not accessible in a way that that improves their overall performance of their ITSM system. So these 5 use cases come from different parts of the stack, believe it or not. It comes from a database part of the stack. It comes from a networking part of the stack. And then the third ones come from, I think, a server part of the stack. But they have the data. The problem is it's not necessarily being processed effectively. So we are working with them to handle the processing, structure, and accessibility so that we can expose and surface that data into useful information. And we believe that, still in pilot mode, we believe that they will see meaningful benefits, a reduction of some of their KPIs, improving of the KPIs, because we're unlocking the data for them and turning it into useful information. So we'll have more of that, and we hope, you know, as we move through the summer, we'll be able to talk about that more through these webinars.
Great, thanks. On our closing slide, if you have additional questions for us, you can reach us at solutionsteam@effecttech.com, or feel free to reach us from our contact page on our website at effecttech.com. Thank you again for your time today, and have a great day.